With reference to our guest, I think he's written, this is his third book. He did a book on Tip O'Neill, a big book, an extraordinarily well-received book. He did a book on Clarence Darrow, and he came to the City Club, he came to the Denver Forum, and now he's back on his new book. And he broke a major story, which got him on the front page of the New York Times, got him on a lot of cable news, talk shows, a lot. In fact, a couple of weeks ago when he spoke to the writers' series of the Red Sox, we all had a glass of wine afterwards, and then he had to go do an interview with CNN. And now his book has made the bestseller list. That's just remarkable. I've heard this presentation. I thought it was as good as any I've ever heard. I think you will agree. Welcome, please, Jack Farrell. Thank you, sir.
The last time I was here for Clarence Darrow, George reminds me that of this story. I was out with my wife, and we were touring California, doing the same thing I'm doing this time. And I was ready for the City Club of San Diego, and there was some sort of convention in downtown San Diego. And so whether it was the Holiday Inn or the Grant Hotel, I can't remember where he had originally booked us, we couldn't get a room. And so, of course, we were taking out I guess we didn't have smartphones in those days, but we were trying to figure out where we were going to stay. And George sort of draws himself up and says, "I am not a man without some significance in this community." And he gives us this address in Del Mar, near the racetrack. Is that the neighborhood? And we go there, and it's a luxury hotel where they give you a house. And for dinner that night, we walked into this courtyard, and they had gotten chefs and bartenders from all over the world to come together and mix drinks that met exactly the taste of that particular meal. So our last experience in San Diego was just unparalleled because of George. And so this time I figure, well, it's never going to be matched. And I get the bestseller list, and my publisher books me in La Valencia in La Jolla on the ocean. And so right now San Diego and La Jolla are looking pretty good to me. And so I was on the phone last night with my wife, and she and I had a choice. We could go to Denver for the Denver Post, or we could go to San Diego. This was back in the 1980s, and work for the Los Angeles Times Bureau here in San Diego. And at that time, she was the deputy store manager for a big department store, and I was a struggling writer. And we picked Denver, and that led us to Boston, and that led us to Washington. And I started writing books. She went back and got her master's and became a teacher. She teaches 7th grade, which is why she's not out on this trip with me. They're still in school. And we were talking last night. Well, where would we be if we had stayed in San Diego? Do you think we ever would have come back east? And we both immediately said, no way. And then as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, she went to the Fashion Institute of Technology, and she was skilled in design. She probably would own like a really swank boutique in La Jolla right now, and I would be her pool boy. George, thank you very much for that introduction. As Lyndon Johnson used to say, it's one that a father would appreciate and a mother would believe. I thought I would start with a segment from the White House tapes. When we do the tapes tonight, remember expletives deleted? In the middle of Watergate, they released the tapes, and every time Nixon said damn or goddamn, and I feel bad doing this in a Methodist church, but they put expletive deleted instead. So this, I'm not going to do expletive deleted. These are words that you've all heard before, and just forgive the profanity. This is a tape that very few people have heard. I think the first time it was ever read in public may have been in Boston. And the day is Saturday, December 9th, 1972. The #1 hit in America is I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar by Helen Reddy to sort of place you in that mood. And in the movies, the theatergoers were flocking to see the Poseidon Adventure. And Nixon was preoccupied with several things. He had just won re-election, but he was preoccupied with the stalled Vietnam peace talks. If you remember, Henry Kissinger had said right before the election that peace is at hand, and it wasn't. In a few more days, Nixon, after this tape, Nixon will order the B-52s to attack Hanoi in what was known as the Christmas bombing. He's also preoccupied with Watergate, and the day before, on another tape, you can hear him discussing with his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, how the wife of one of the Watergate burglars was killed in a plane crash in Chicago, and the two of them are a little nice about it and wondering how Howard Hunt is doing, but mostly they want to know whether or not the Hunts were smart enough to have laundered the $10,000 and $100 bills that was found in her purse in the wreckage of the airplane. So all this is on his mind, but this is also football season, and Nixon was a big football fan. And in the National Football League, there was a late season game between the Redskins, his team, and the Dallas Cowboys. The Skins had clinched a playoff spot, but it was really important for the Cowboys to win so they could get the wild card. It was a 4 p.m. start, and Dallas roared out ahead in the first half to Nixon's great dismay with a 28-3 halftime lead. And then in the second half, the Redskins start coming back, and it's really tense. It's really a gripping football game. And it's at this point that the First Lady, Pat Nixon, sends her daughter, Julie, up to get her father because they've been waiting dinner now for half an hour. Dinner is getting cold, and Julie, go up and get your father and bring him down to the dinner table. Well, like 100,000 other daughters, Julie doesn't like being caught between the two parents. So she's going to approach this conversation very gently. She's actually kind of happy that her dad is relaxing and watching the game. And Nixon knows that Pat is fuming, but he just got to see how this game turns out. So this is an actual White House transcript from the tapes. Julie, Daddy, how much longer is the game going to be on? The President, just a few more minutes. It's so good. You don't mind if I see it. Julie, nuh-uh. 5 minutes, would you say? The President, 5 minutes. Or do you think we better go now? Julie, no. The President, you're sure? Julie, 5 or 10 minutes, you think? The President, a little more. It's a very close game. Well, good. I'm glad it turned out closer, Daddy. The President, you know what it was? It was 28-0. Julie, yeah. The President, and now it's 31-24. The Redskins have come back. It's very close. Pause. Julie, how many more minutes are there left in the game? The President, about 10 minutes. The President, key play. The President, hit him, God damn it! Announcer in the background, touchdown for Dallas. The President, damn it! Julie, uh-oh, is that bad? The President, son of a bitch! Julie, that's bad. The President, well, I don't care anyway. He turns off the television, leaves the room, and he and his daughter go down to Sunday dinner. So that's the top secret White House tape I had for you tonight. We were discussing at our dinner table how the timing for this book is at the very least fortuitous. It's published at a time when we've had a break-in at DNC headquarters and hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets of Washington, an attorney general forced to resign, allegations of wiretapping, and a war declared upon the press. And that all happened in the first 100 days. And I have a friend, Nicole, down at the University of Virginia, who called me up the other day, and she said, Jack, this is like we're reliving the Nixon years as speed dating. Or as Mark Twain put it, history does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. The Trump era. I'm sure that we are providing great entertainment to Richard Nixon there in his perch in the afterlife. He's probably looking up at us right now and saying, you see, Bob, I was right. They'll miss me when I'm gone. But it's like Groucho said in the movie Duck Soup, where he played Rufus T. Firefly, the president of Fredonia. If you think this country is bad off now, just wait till I get through with it. And Congress, I'm sorry I said that, Groucho said after insulting a congressman from Fredonia. I'm not being fair to the rest of the baboons. The question I'm asked most often, most recently on the 5:30 news here, is why Nixon now? The short answer is that an editor saw the need for a one-volume biography of Nixon that updates the story with all the tapes and records that have come out since the turn of the century. There are some 3,700 hours of those White House tapes, of which now 3,000 hours have been released. Stephen Ambrose and the other 20th century biographers had access to just a few dozen hours. I was lucky I had the whole smorgasbord. And they offer hours of revealing insight on Watergate, China, Vietnam, and other topics. And there's other stuff that just coincidentally, there's like it must be a 40-year rule in presidential papers, because in 2012, Nixon's alma mater, Whittier College, released some 400 oral history interviews conducted with Nixon's family members, childhood friends, classmates, and neighbors back in the 1970s. And in 2007, the National Archives released dozens of the most politically sensitive folders from the Nixon White House. George made reference to some of the things that were in there. Nixon had fought all his life, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to keep these papers secret. And he passed away, and they went to the Nixon Foundation, and they finally grew tired of storing them and gave them to the Nixon Library, which processed them and released them. And they include Bob Haldeman's campaign files, including his 1968 notes, which confirm that Nixon indeed intervened to scuttle the Lyndon Johnson's peace initiative in the fall of October 1968 by scheming with the South Vietnamese and so win the presidency. The shorthand for that is that it's called the Chenault Affair. And there's a little placard at the Nixon Library where you can read about it and look through all the historical debate over the years as to whether this happened. And I'd like to think that my research shows for good that it did happen and that the words came right out of Nixon's mouth. He told Haldeman, have Anna Chenault, who was one of his campaign aides, keep her working on the South Vietnamese. Any way we can monkey wrench Johnson's initiative, we're going to do it. And there was also an evocative nugget concerning Nixon's Southern strategy, in which in the 1968 convention, the Southern chairmen were getting a little bit nervous about Nixon and thinking about going over to Reagan. And Nixon sent Haldeman over to them to promise that he would cut out the pro-Negro crap if he got elected. And so that again confirms something that we've heard a lot about. History is like, of course you're all from San Diego, so you may not get this analogy, but on the East Coast when we rent a beach house for the summer, the first thing you do is take a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and dump it on a table for the rainy days. And then as you walk in and out for that week, you put a puzzle here and there, and that's basically what history is, and I've managed to find a couple of little puzzles, pieces of that puzzle that now I've qualified by the New York Times. They now call me an historian as opposed to a lapsed reporter. Why Nixon now? Another reason is timing. Next year is the 50th anniversary of Nixon's election. You're going to see an awful lot about Vietnam, about Martin Luther King, about Bobby Kennedy's assassination next year as the news media does all the 50-year anniversaries shows. It was an amazing year. It began with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam and Walter Cronkite declaring that the war was lost. Gene McCarthy almost defeating LBJ in New Hampshire. Robert Kennedy entering the race, Martin Luther King's assassination, Bobby Kennedy's assassination, George Wallace running as a third party, and the bloody riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. It also marks the 50th anniversary of the self-destruction of George Romney, who was Mitt Romney's dad. And he was leading Nixon in the polls when he returned from a visit to Vietnam and announced that he was adjusting his position because he had been brainwashed by the generals at the Pentagon. At which point Eugene McCarthy is said to have said, brainwashed, a light rinse would have been sufficient. Nobody really liked George Romney either. And we'll recognize in these commemorations next year what kind of an icon Richard Nixon is. He's sort of our poster boy, especially for the millennial, the younger generations, of crooked politicians. There's going to be another Star Wars movie out. It'll be the 11th installment of the Skywalker family saga based on Anakin Skywalker, who was based on Richard Nixon. So we are fascinated by this character, even then when we don't know it. The creators of Mad Men, I don't know how many of you were Mad Men fans, but Don Draper was modeled on Richard Nixon, this soulless man coming home from World War II and trying to find his way in the post-World War II era. So when you ask why Nixon, you might as well ask why King Lear or why Batman and Superman. And the life of no president says more about this country, I thought, than Richard Nixon. His accomplishments sing of the finest American attributes: daring, audacity, resilience, grit. And his fall is an incantation of the nation's sins of meanness, greed, racism, and corruption. And we live in the world that Nixon made. That February 1972 opening to China with that planet-stunning handshake with Chairman Mao set Earth and its peoples on this new liberating course. It was the first great crack of the Cold War, the first bell tolling for the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain, and the indispensable step towards this today's integrated world economy that has lifted millions, hundreds of millions of human beings from want and given them, as Nixon fervently hoped, a measure of peace. Political triumph followed. 9 months after his return from China, he won re-election by the largest margin of any president since George Washington, carrying every state except Massachusetts. And then the debacle. In August '74, after 2 years of intrigue and scandal, he became the only president to resign in disgrace. On the anvil of the presidency, in an era of war and rampage, social upheaval, and generational turmoil, the insistent flaws in his character gave way. Consumed by hatred for his enemies, authentic and imagined, Nixon ordered illegal wiretaps, burglaries, and assaults, and the cover-up that eventually brought him down. Well, his nature was as faceted as the course of his career. One thing about Henry Kissinger is he's a great writer, and he wrote 3 volumes set about his time in Nixon. A lot of it is self-congratulatory because Kissinger was one of those self-made men who is forever enthralled to his creator. But he is a great writer. I cannot deny him that. And this is what he had to say about Richard Nixon. I thought it was particularly telling. Any attempt to sum up his complex character in one attribute is bound to be misleading. The detractors' view that Nixon was an incarnation of evil is as wrong as the adulation of his most fervent admirers. On closer acquaintance, one realized that what gave Nixon his driven quality was the titanic struggle among the various personalities within him, and it was a struggle that never ended. There was never a permanent victor between the dark and the sensitive sides of his nature, said Kissinger. Now one, now another personality predominated, creating an overall impression of menace, of torment, of unpredictability, and in the final analysis, of enormous vulnerability. Nixon was a romantic and an idealist who asked to use Woodrow Wilson's desk in the Oval Office and took the oath of office on a Quaker Bible open to the beatitude, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And he may have been our last progressive president, certainly our last progressive Republican president. His White House was peopled with bright young men who designed laudable reforms for health care, poverty, civil rights and affirmative action, Native American rights, and especially the protection of the environment. He could be achingly, clumsily kind. In law school, he befriended a disabled classmate and helped him to class every day. And in the 1930s, when such things were unheard of, black students were welcome in the college social club that Nixon founded at Whittier College. Once in Washington in the 1950s, an aide found Nixon carrying a doll under his arm and assumed it was a gift for Tricia or Julie, at that time the vice president's daughters. No, Nixon said the doll was for this little poor and crippled girl that he'd seen in the morning newspaper. The aide, who was the press aide, said, "Well, this will make a great picture. You know, you're known as Tricky Dick. We're going to humanize you. Let me get the Post and the Star. We'll have the cameras there." Nixon said, "No, never, never. If you mention to the press," he told his staffer, "I'll cut your balls off." He was a square. The young Roger Ailes, who helped craft Nixon's resurgence, said that Nixon was 42 years old the day he was born, and that voters figure other kids got footballs for Christmas, but Nixon got a briefcase, and he loved it. That squareness, that discipline hid immense personal hurt. He was hard to love, and he knew it. He was raised in the Hicks. In the middle of the book, there's a photo array which shows Yorba Linda in 1913. It looks like Oklahoma during the dust storms. He was the son of a loud, uncouth grocer and an austere and often absent mom, who famously, Nixon said, never told him that she loved him. His childhood was marked by emotional privation and the death of two cherished brothers, young Arthur, who died in a week of tubercular meningitis, and his older brother, Harold, the star of the family, who died over a period of 6 years from tuberculosis. It all left Nixon awkward and shy and peculiar. And there are moments as you read through the books where you're just going to go, oh, ouch, you know. Dick, please get hold of yourself. Stop whipping yourself like that. When he was a boy of 10, he had a school assignment to write a letter. You know, you have to write a business letter, you have to write a personal letter. And he wrote a letter to his absent mother, who was off tending to Harold in Arizona. I wish you would come home right now, Nixon wrote, and he signed it, your good dog, Richard. As a young man, he was spurned by the Eastern elites, and he seethed ever after with resentments. He skulked through life. People react to fear, not love, he told speechwriter William Safire. They don't teach you that in Sunday school, but it's true. And his dark side inspired his enemies, who became almost lyrical in their denunciations. Chief Justice Earl Warren called him tricky. And tricky, he said, was despicable, a cheat, a liar, and a crook. And the hours of the White House tapes show that both the perceptive and the visionary Nixon, and as you read this book, you're going to see the phrase, and yet, a lot. But also his rancor, his venality, his paranoia, and his bigotry. You say something good about Nixon, and you have to say, and yet, and refer to something ugly. You say something ugly about Nixon, and you have to say, and yet, and talk about something that's redeeming. But the tapes are pretty rough on him. I want, Bob, more use of wiretapping. Put your money on surveillance. Maybe it's the wrong thing to do, but if you're going to start, we have to start now. Maybe we can get a real scandal on some of the leading Democrats. Break into the place, rifle the files, bring them in. God damn it, get in there and get those files. Blow the safe and get them. Play it tough. That's the way they play it, and that's the way we're going to play it. Well, after he resigned and he was in San Clemente, one of his aides went out to see him, and it was captured Nixon in an amazingly reflective moment where Nixon tried to tell him why he had ended up where he ended up. So this is Nixon talking. What starts the process really are the laughs and the slights and the snubs when you're a kid. But if you're reasonably intelligent and your anger is deep enough and strong enough, you learn you can change those attitudes by excellence, by personal gut performance, while those who have everything are sitting on their fat butts. It's a piece of cake until you get to the top, Nixon said. And then you find you can't stop playing the game the way you've always played it because it's a part of you, and you need it as much as an arm or a leg. So you're lean, and you're mean, and you're resourceful, and you continue to walk on the edge of the precipice because over the years you've become fascinated by how close to the edge you can walk without losing your balance. Except this time, Nixon said, we had something to lose. Well, why Nixon now? For many Americans, he remains that caricature. 2/3 of the country were not alive or living in the United States when Nixon resigned in 1974. The millennial generation is now America's biggest generation. So I wrote the book for them as a matter of practical necessity, but also I wanted to communicate to my kids' generation about who this guy was. For them, Nixon is someone they've seen on The Simpsons or as the villain in the X-Files movie or the mask that the bank robbers always put over their face before they go in to do the heist. But the kids are interested, curious, especially in this time of Trump, to learn about this guy and to learn about this thing called Watergate. And just what Mr. Spock meant when he told the Federation Congress in that Star Trek movie that there's an old Vulcan proverb, only Nixon could go to China. The book had the original working title of Richard Nixon, An American Tragedy, for it's really a classic tragic story. As Kissinger said, it was like one of those Greek things where a man is told his fate and fulfills it anyway. He had those qualities that were truly heroic, raising himself by pure will out of Nowheresville. He volunteered for service in World War II and continually pushed the Navy until they assigned him to a combat zone. He came home like JFK and ran for office, part of the new generation offering leadership. He had no famous family, no Ivy League education, no political machine or contacts, no name recognition. It is hard to exaggerate what a long shot he was when he entered politics in 1946, and within 6 years, he had gone from literally nothing to Vice President of the United States. And after 8 years of very turbulent service as Eisenhower's Vice President, he ran against JFK for president in 1960. And Kennedy, I was surprised to discover, was his close friend. Pat and Dick were invited to attend Jack and Jackie's wedding, and Nixon refused to campaign in Massachusetts when Kennedy was on the ballot running for re-election. "He is the kind of man the country needs," said the young Jack Kennedy after meeting Nixon in the House. And Nixon prayed aloud when Kennedy was dodging death on the operating table. Nixon was spotted in the hallway at Walter Reed saying, "Poor brave Jack's gonna die. Oh God, don't let him die." And so the hurt and the anger were twice as intense when Nixon figured that the Kennedys had stolen the '60 election from him. And Julie told me that it was that experience of 1960 that left her father with the grim resolve of never going to be out-cheated again. Now, and yet, Nixon was no saint. Bob Dole, remember Bob Dole, wounded in war, recalled how Nixon was the one politician who always remembered to extend his left hand. Bob Dole was paralyzed on the right-hand side. And it was Bob Dole who gave Nixon's eulogy at the funeral and broke down in agony. And it's painful to watch. They have it on a repeating tape at the Nixon Library. But it was Dole as well who, after seeing the American delegation to Anwar Sadat's funeral, President Gerald Ford, President Jimmy Carter, and President Richard Nixon, called them "see no evil, hear no evil, and evil." But Nixon had a way. That might be the greatest wisecrack ever in Washington history. Nixon had a way of taking his anger and his hatred and honing it and using it. He had an unequaled ability to tap the grievances, identify and then tap the grievances and resentments of class, of race, and envy that he perceived in his audience. The Democratic speechwriter Richard Goodwin, who ended up marrying Doris Kearns, said that Nixon could reach with uncanny intuition the buried doubts, the secret dreads, the nightmare panic of the threatened soul. In part through self-discernment, Nixon recognized the defects of human character and employed that knowledge to poison and manipulate his countrymen. He persuaded Americans to gnaw, as he did, on grievances and to look at each other as enemies. It was Nixon who helped launch the McCarthy era, whose aides drafted the Declaration of the Culture War, who set South against North and spurred his silent majority to despise and distrust the country's elect institutions. This too is Nixon's legacy and his mark upon our world, a country divided and polarized, clawing at itself as he did. For here is the tragic flaw. As driven as he was, as bright as he was scarred by that childhood. He was insecure. He was paranoid. He never was certain he had earned it, Henry Kissinger said. Nixon became Iago to his own Othello, always whispering in his own ear, saying that you're not worth it, didn't deserve that, it was good luck. People don't love you, and there's a reason for it. There's a painful tape where he comes home from China, his greatest triumph, the completion of his greatest dream. And he's in the Oval Office talking to Kissinger, and he says, "Henry, the American people are such sheep. They took all that crap in Beijing serious. You and I know that it means nothing in the matters of the world." He didn't believe that. He believed that he had actually done something fine, and he did do something fine and grand. Yet he could not stand the idea that Richard Nixon had done something successful. He was always looking for disaster. And so he lived on risk and sensation. He was quite a bold politician to escape that pain and self-doubt. His aide, Monica Crowley, wrote that he was like a gambler, waiting for that sublime moment when the wagers had been made, the money was down, and the dice were in the air. And he did not recognize it until the end. But in the end, he did. There's no scene in politics, law, or art or commerce in American history to match that of August 9th, 1974, the tormented Nixon standing in the East Room, pouring out his guts in a rambling plea. So, I wish I could have memorized it. I'll read a short excerpt. The final hours had more than their share of Shakespearean scenes. Nixon choking back sobs and rushing from the room after telling a group of his old friends from Congress, "I hope you won't feel I've let you down." The leaders of the House and Senate leaving Nixon and hearing from the crowds outside the White House gates, the people singing, "God Bless America." Nixon asking Kissinger to join him on his knees in prayer in the Lincoln bedroom. But no scene in a career of astonishing spectacle was as memorable as Nixon's farewell talk to the White House. The actor met the moment. It may have been the most raw, acutely painful, and unforgettable speech in American political history. Tricia recorded it in her diary. Do not trip over wires. Stand on name marker. Reach for Mama's hand. Hold it. Applause. Daddy is speaking. People are letting tears roll down their cheeks. Must not look. Must not think of it. The real Nixon is being revealed as only he can reveal himself. By speaking from the heart, people could finally know Daddy. It was not too late. Nixon tried that one more time to tell people who he was. How lonely, how alone. Nobody will ever write a book probably about my mother, he said. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother, but my mother was a saint. I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die, and when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she'll have no books written about her, but she was a saint. And then came proof of his astonishing resilience. We think that when someone dear to us dies, we think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer defeat, that all has ended. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us. Because the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be in the highest mountain. In the audience, Kissinger thought there was a fated doom about the man. Many in the audience were weeping. And in the end, from Richard Nixon came words as wise as any ever spoken in that great old house, rich in self-knowledge purchased at a price. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself. Dick and Pat made their way out to the South Lawn, walked down a long red carpet, shook hands with a funereal vice president, and climbed the steps of the presidential helicopter Army One. At the last, Nixon turned and, grimacing, gave one sweeping defensive wave as if to ward off unquenchable grief. And he thrust his arms skyward, flashing the trademark V's for victory, turned and entered the helicopter. Army One lifted from the lawn, rose above the muggy Capitol, the National Mall dimmed in a summer morning's haze. Below, L'Enfant's grand boulevards and Brumidi's halls and corridors pulsed with visionaries, parvenus, and hustlers, with dreams and scheming, with avarice, ambition, rivalry, and purpose. The chopper soared over statues of heroes and monuments to great statesmen whose ranks with such American audacity the awkward grocer's boy had presumed to join, had come so near only to fall. It's so sad, Pat said, to no one in particular. They spent the flight to California alone, each in his or her cabin on Air Force One. The president had a cocktail. At noon, when they were somewhere over Missouri, the resignation took effect. Why Nixon now? It's vital that we learn from Nixon's parting words. Today's polarization is more than just a political phenomenon. It really threatens, in this 21st century, the American ideal. And that ideal is, and has always been, that a self-governed people, varied in national origin, in faith, in the color of their skins, can still be, as John Winthrop preached upon the ship Arbella to his fellow pilgrims as they sailed into Massachusetts Bay, a city upon a hill. That this new world beacon not only shines for others about such virtues as liberty and equality, but demonstrates that in nations as diverse as ours, that these values are achievable. And that's the challenge we face now. If we lose this battle here in this country with its wealth and its sturdy institutions and its deep abiding beliefs and all the hard-won gains that have been made in equality of gender and race and sexual orientation, then it is difficult to see how other democracies resist such hatred there. In this book, you'll find the phrase, "and yet." For almost all of Nixon's sins, a biographer has to respond. And yet, and here's my favorite and yet, Nixon was known for running a particularly harsh 1968 campaign. It was called the Law and Order Campaign. And yet, here's an excerpt of a speech he gave in Philadelphia that fall. "You are fortunate people," he told an audience outside Philadelphia, "but you know that in the great cities of America there is terrible poverty. There are poor people, there are people who haven't had the chance that you've had. You cannot be an island in the world. You cannot live in your comfortable houses and say, well, just as long as I got mine, I don't have to worry about the others. This isn't going to be a good country for any of us to live in until it's a good country for all of us to live in." This is Richard Nixon. So after 3 books, I've been christened a historian by the New York Times, and historians get to do stuff like quote from Abraham Lincoln. In 1838, Lincoln said, "All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, with a Bonaparte as their commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track on the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1,000 years. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? If it ever must reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It won't come from abroad. If destruction be our lot," Lincoln said, "we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide." And that was the meaning of Barack Obama's Nobel Prize. It was not for him. He hadn't done anything particularly wonderful to qualify for it except win that election. It was the world saying to us, all of us, bravo, keep it up. You inspire us. Keep being America. Now, we were that people then, and we will be that people again. Nixon taught us, it is only a beginning, always. It's refreshing and reassuring, having toured college campuses and engaged in debate with my children's generation, that these millennials have it figured out. Their values are good, they're fair and generous. So our task in the immediate future is to not tear ourselves apart, to be Horatius at the bridge, not to die by suicide, not to succumb to hatred. Because as Nixon told us, if you hate, you destroy yourself. And that's the answer to the question, why Nixon now? Thanks very much. I'd love to take some questions after.
Well, we have time for a dialogue or questions. John Freeman first, Paul Kruger next.
Sir, that was a lovely presentation. I have a question though. What's in those 18 minutes?
The 18 minutes were the first discussion in the White House between Nixon and Haldeman of Watergate. And Haldeman later recreated it from memory. And what he said that was Nixon saying to Haldeman, you know, I was on you guys, I was on Colson especially, Chuck Colson, his aide, so much to get stuff on the Democrats that doubtless it got carried away, and Bob Colson can point the finger at the president. So that's the way that Haldeman, who's the other member of the conversation, remembered it. And that's in his memoirs.
Paul.
I was curious how, as a journalist, you were able to compete with historians who, you know, I mean, some of them are, their practice is dedicated, say, to the Nixon era. How did you get the tapes when they must have been very aware of the release times and everything?
In law school, Duke Law School, Nixon was known as Iron Butt because he never left the law library. And I have a little bit of Iron Butt in me, which may be freed from having to teach classes. Is an advantage over historians. Part of it is just luck. I mean, the tapes are out there. You can listen to all the tapes online, several different places. YouTube has the greatest hits with transcripts, which makes it very helpful, including that conversation with Julie about the football game. You can actually hear that. It's a wonderful, wonderful tape. But the short answer is just, you know, it's a matter of luck and what old city editors tell young reporters, which is to turn every page.
Jamie Rito, and then Holly, and then Ira.
John, what would you say was the ultimate catalyst for his downfall? Was it his father? Was it his father? Was it one thing above all else that?
I spend a lot of time on the formation of Richard Nixon's character before I get to the presidency. And in fact, if I'm criticized in reviews, it's usually that I only give 200 pages to the presidency, and I give so much 300 pages to
about his whole life.
everything that came before. It's a biography. It's about his life. His mother was a saint, but she was, to him, totally dominated his life. He craved her affection, didn't get it for a variety of reasons. His father was this blowhard, so he was like caught forever between an iceberg and a volcano. And then his brothers started dying. Little Arthur was the golden-haired baby of the family, and then his older brother, who was his father's, best and brightest, and his father was never shy about saying that in front of Nixon. One of the first pages of the book, there's this letter that Nixon writes to his niece on the day she's born. He's in the combat zone in the South Pacific. And he writes this letter and he says, I'm going to give you the scuttlebutt about your relatives, but everybody in Whittier must be wondering right now how Don, my other brother, got to be such a wonderful, popular guy and had such a sourpuss brother like me. And that was Nixon's identification of himself. I know all along it didn't take us to tell him that he was a sourpuss, that he was a square, that he was peculiar. He knew it all along. He always suspected from the way he was treated by his parents and by what happened in his life that he was not easy to love, and always felt that he had to then manifest himself more aggressively against his critics or his enemies.
Always.
Why was he recording private moments with his family? I knew he recorded a lot.
Yeah, well, it was
That's
basic.
fascinating.
The short answer is Richard Nixon was a klutz. LBJ and JFK and Harry Truman and Eisenhower and Franklin Roosevelt all had some sort of tape recording systems with an on-off switch, so that they would, if they knew they were on a telephone call with somebody who was going to blackmail them politically or be rough with them politically, they could turn it on and get it on tape. Or if they knew there was going to be a moment that was going to look great in their memoirs, they could turn it on and record it for posterity. The JFK tapes, Kennedy had an amazing ability to turn them on at the, amazing debates over the Cuban Missile Crisis, what we're going to do in Vietnam. But Nixon was a klutz, and he could never figure out how to turn them on and off. And so Haldeman said, oh my God, if we give him to this, it's never going to work. He's going to turn it off when he should be on, et cetera. So we're going to make them voice activated. And so anybody walks into the Oval Office, stewards whistling, a toilet is flushed in the presidential bathroom. It's on the tapes. And then he couldn't be satisfied with just having the Oval Office. Then he had to have his hideaway office, and then he had to have Camp David, and then he had to have the upstairs living quarters at the White House. They had tapes running all over the place. And most of what you heard tonight, the new museum in Yorba Linda is a spectacular display. It's very honest. And a lot of that stuff is in there, and there's this diagram of the White House showing all the arrows where all the tape recorders were, and it's it's amazing that there wasn't anything that anything escaped being taped.
Ira, and then Gordon.
One of the things that's always been amazing, I think, is that, and all during this period, was he wasn't really that attractive a candidate or that attractive a politician. And he didn't spend all the time courting people and building a constituency, etc. How did he manage to get where he got with that kind of personality? How do you figure it?
A large part of it was just drive. Very early in the first campaign, it became aware that Nixon had a hang-up with women voters. He couldn't look them in the eye. He just had this thing about women that he, again, going back to his mom. And they said, oh my God, we got, Republican women's clubs he's going to go out to. We have all the women who worked in the factories during World War II are now more independent. They're going to want to hear from this guy. And they said, Nick, you cannot leave half of the electorate out. You've got to be able to look every voter in the eye. And so, as with every challenge he ever faced, he worked at it. He studied. He practiced. And they actually had a tryout. They went to Scripps College, and they got a bunch of what were then known as co-eds and put them in a room with him and let them fire questions at him. And he managed to show that he had the ability to look them in the eye just by drive. His speeches he always gave off the top of his, with no notes, no papers whatsoever. And he did that by repeatedly writing out on yellow legal pads the speech until he had it ingrained in his head and he could stand. And you can see in that first campaign, the Democrats are going back to Jerry Voorhis, who was his opponent, and they're saying this guy just stood up and answered questions and spoke for 60 minutes without a single bit of paper. You know, we really need to pay attention to it. And he was lucky, and he also had the conservative tide after World War II. There was a reaction, and he had that wind behind him. You know, he just didn't win in 1946. The Republicans took both houses because people were tired of the regimentation of the war and the New Deal. And then he runs for the Senate against Helen Gahagan Douglas here in California, and the Korean War breaks out. And that just makes perfect milieu for him to use the red baiting stuff against her. And then Eisenhower needs a young guy, a young veteran from California, and Nixon does his usual skullduggery and betrays Earl Warren and helps Eisenhower win the nomination in Chicago. And all of a sudden, there he is, a national figure. So I loved that part. I hope you all like it, but that's how I began the book, with Richard Nixon coming home from war and entering the fray and examining how he did it. Then I flash back to the boyhood days.
Talk to us for a moment about the relationship between President Eisenhower and his vice president.
Well, Eisenhower was the liberator of Europe and the supreme commander, and he was used to palling around with Stalin and Winston Churchill, and here was this second lieutenant from the Navy who was vice president, which, you know, and Eisenhower looked at him and said, staff. You know, dispensable staff, you know. Took what he could from this guy's gifts, but didn't really go out of his way to groom him, never invited him, you know, to play cards or golf or whatever. I mean, the times that happened, that the two of them went out on the golf course, were notable, and you can almost find comments about each time it happened. And then Eisenhower has a heart attack, and Nixon performs superbly. The entire nation is looking at him, and he is tactful, and he doesn't summon the cabinet members into the Oval Office and sit at the president's desk. He goes to their office. He just absolutely performs fantastically as vice president. There's not a bit of criticism you can find. And Eisenhower comes back from the heart attack and calls him in and says, Dick, how'd you like to not be my vice president anymore? And Nixon is crushed. But Eisenhower, confronted with his own mortality, thinking that he might not last another term, doesn't want Dick Nixon as vice president. So he offers him Secretary of Defense, or he offers him Secretary of State. And Nixon says no, and for 6 months there's this, can you imagine what would happen if this was all, and this is all playing out in the papers. So for 6 months there's this national saga of Ike and Dick, and is he going to dump him from the ticket? And then finally, the Republican rank and file are pressuring the president, and the president can't find anybody else who's better, and he just sort of glumly accepts Nixon. By the end of the second term, Eisenhower had gotten more respect. He had sent Nixon on many foreign missions, and Nixon had performed ably. And by '68, Ike's grandson married Nixon's daughter, and the thing was very, very tight. But then Ike dies like the first year of the Nixon presidency, and Nixon hears it in the Oval Office. And he puts his hands over his eyes, and he flees the Oval Office and goes into that little anteroom behind it and weeps because Eisenhower was obviously a major father figure for him as well.
The gentleman in the back in the orange hat.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
The question has to do with the way it was announced on NPR this morning. They said the title of your talk is Richard Nixon's Dirty Tricks. I'd like to ask, my question is, how did he and his team manage to hire plumbers?
It was all Daniel Ellsberg's fault. Daniel Ellsberg was the great whistleblower who turned over the set of a secret Pentagon study of the war in Vietnam called the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, and the New York Times published it. And the great irony is, and this is just so indicative of Nixon's character, is that the Pentagon Papers stop before Nixon takes office. So everything in it is about JFK and LBJ. And the first 24 hours, Kissinger and Haldeman they're cheering each other, they're giving each other high fives and saying, boy, the Democrats are going to be in a mess about this, aren't they? And Richard Nixon can't let well enough alone. He sees the New York Times his enemy. He hates the press is the enemy. The Press is the enemy. Write that on the blackboard 100 times. The press is the enemy. And
Familiar.
yeah, and he jumps into the fray, and he loses. He loses at the Supreme Court, made up of judges that almost not a total majority, but dotted with judges that he had appointed, and he's furious. And so he calls in Colson and Haldeman, and he says, "I want." Oh, and other presidents in this situation would have turned to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, and they would do all the dirty work for them. But Hoover in his old age was getting smart, and he saw that the times had changed, and the 1960s would not put up with that kind of stuff anymore. And he didn't want his legacy ruined, and he didn't want his bureau tainted with endless recriminations about eavesdropping and chasing down dissidents. So Nixon brought it in-house, and they bring in guys like Gordon Liddy, loose cannons, Howard Hunt, and they immediately go out and screw up their first assignment, which is to break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. And amazingly, they get, instead of getting fired, like all classic bureaucracies, they solve the problem by moving them, make them somebody else's problem. And they shift them over to the campaign. And there's this young kid named Jed Magruder who's totally intimidated by them, who thinks that the president wants these guys doing what they're doing and sends them into the Watergate.
Can I ask one more question about your?
But Gordon first, and Jonathan Gordon.
Really appreciate your utilizing the and yet frame. I've always thought Nixon was more complex than I thought he was when I was railing against him.
Mm-hmm.
But
You
I'm
and me
wondering
both.
If you might you expand that theme in connection with the idea that the center has moved so far to the right since then that Nixon couldn't get nominated today by today's Republican Party for sure. Maybe not even, you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's very, it's interesting because the left will never embrace him, at least not the left who were alive when he was alive. And the right went over to Reaganism and a much more strict version of conservatism. And so they renounce him. Pat Buchanan says wonderful things about him now, but at the time Buchanan was nutso crazy because they were doing all this social stuff and going to China and making friends with the Red Chinese. So Nixon's sort of like, there's planets in the solar system, and then there's the asteroid belt, which is unique in itself. He's like the asteroid belt. He's just like, he's not embraced by anybody. And there's, the two places I didn't get invited to talk about Nixon were Fox News and NPR. So the two polar extremes were not interested, or it could be that there's just been too much Nixon recently. But so that said, history will look back, and one of the sort of the frightening things, if you think about your own mortality, is to think about this: the Vietnam War, which played such an amazing role in my life and many of your lives, is now being sort of tucked on a shelf by historians next to the Korean War. Just like one of those little brush wars from the 20th century that 50,000 died. Not a big deal, didn't change the course of world events. And of course, if that happens, and Watergate continues to be sort of looked at as a politics as usual, Nixon could steadily climb because he signed the first strategic arms treaty with the Russians. He went to China. He created the EPA. He created OSHA. He signed a lot of progressive legislation that Democrats put on his desk, especially environmental legislation. The leading environmental groups, I'll end with this, were polled several years ago. Which president was the best president for the environment? Teddy Roosevelt, of course, came first, and Richard Nixon came in second. So.
And American Indians too.
And American Indians, yep.
My friends don't know that he signed the enormously better Indian policy.
That's right. The policy when he went into office was to assimilate all Indians, get them off the reservations, get them into the cities, and Nixon signed the Self-Determination Act. He's still revered on the reservations for that. There's lots. You'll be astounded as you go through. I never knew Social Security cost of living raises. The Endangered Species Act. There's very little that that he didn't touch. He didn't touch the social issues like abortion and guns. He didn't like that. But
Jonathan.
Last week, Fred Kaplan of Slate was being interviewed on the media talking about the madman theory. And he was comparing Nixon using the madman theory to Trump and just kind of the level of unpredictability, how it can work in the short run, not so much in the long run, because it only works in the short run if there's a greater context to it. I wonder if, if you looked at that with Nixon, in terms of when he applied madman theory and how that fit into his general character.
well, it was Chairman Mao who actually said only Nixon can go to China, and because only the right can do what the left can't would be suspect with, and Nixon sort of expanded that even more so. He worked on the fact that he was the anti-communist of all anti-communists, and that if he did things like put the U.S. forces on alert, the Russians would never be quite sure that he didn't really mean it. And at this point, we were almost at parity with the Soviet Union, but we still had superiority in nuclear weapons. So when he did a madman dance, the world took notice. But it didn't work with the North Vietnamese. I mean, it had its limits. There's a famous North Vietnamese memo right before the Easter Offensive of 1972, where they say, they tell all the troops in the field that Nixon is liable to use, exceptional weapons of power, meaning, massive B-52 bombings and maybe nuclear weapons. So just get ready for it. But they were still going to stay in the war. So there was a limit to how his craziness could intimidate folks. But he always knew when he was employing it. And I'm not so sure that that Trump has this strategic sense of when to use it, when to do the art of the deal, the great bargainer, when you want to take all your chips and storm out, and then come back 2 days later and offer the car salesman, $2,000 less. I'm not sure that Trump has figured out how to be crazy as a fox as opposed to just crazy.
Last question to Mark Dillon.
You said that he wouldn't play golf or cards with Eisenhower. Did he have long-term, close personal friends that he chummed around with? And if he did, what kind of people were they?
No, he didn't. He had a couple of rich guys. Bob Applenop, the guy who invented the spray valve, and B.B. Rebozo, who was this guy who was not a tremendously wealthy man, but a wealthy guy from Florida who had made a business of inviting U.S. senators down to Florida, taking them out on his boat, having parties for them, and struck up a particular friendship with Nixon. But the friendship in that case, according to everybody, including Rebozo, was that Rebozo was nowhere in Nixon's intellectual class, and so and knew just to keep his mouth shut, so that they would go out on Rebozo's houseboat and cruise around Biscayne Bay and never say a word. And Nixon was always on walking the beach all his life, always drawn to the beach, San Clemente, Key Biscayne. And I had I had an interview with his younger brother, Edward, who's still alive. And I said, why did Dick always go to the beach? And he said, oh, that was simple. The noise of the waves, it was white noise. Drowned out everything and just let Dick stay in that brain thinking, figuring things out. So he was, in some ways he was almost robotic or, a walking computer. He never had very close friends. Pat probably was the closest person to him, and there was lots of periods of estrangement and formality between he and Pat. Although I must say that one of my biggest surprises in writing the book was that I just fell head over heels in love with Pat Nixon, because she just is such a funny, sardonic, sarcastic person, and never came across what she was like in private. And if there's a picture in the dictionary next to long-suffering, it should be her.
Tell the story about going to Seattle to see his brother.
Yeah, so Ed is probably in his 90s, and he is a geologist, and he was a helicopter pilot in the Navy or the Coast Guard. So I go up there to interview him, and we spend the morning, and I say,
Seattle.
Yeah, in Seattle. And I say, why don't we go out and, I'll get lunch. I'll get us lunch. And he says, oh, no, no, no. I said, I got coupons for the Burger King. So I say, okay, well, come on, I'll drive. And he says, oh, no, 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 no. You know, he's a former helicopter pilot. He's going to still drive. He's 92 years old. So we hop in his like Monte Carlo and we take off on the interstate outside of Chicago when we go up 2 exits so we can go and get 50 cents off the Whoppers at the next, at the next Burger King. So.
Well, this has been great. I want to thank Ken from La Jolla Country Day. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
That was great for the help. And those of you, Chris Schaefer, this will be on YouTube tomorrow, Chris. All City Club programs can be seen on YouTube. It's just another part of what we do. Last thing about Nixon, he was actually a very knowledgeable guy about baseball. He really, no, seriously, he was. And if you go to, you can go to baseball-reference.com and you can see Nixon's all-time baseball team, which he divided into 25 to 45 and 45 to 70. So he picked the American League All-Stars and the National League All-Stars 25 to 45 and then 45 to 70. And then he had 7 categories of the players that he thought were the best, like Ted Williams was the best hitter. He really knew a lot about baseball. And Dick Young, the sports columnist of the New York Daily News, said that Nixon was one of those presidents that when he went to Griffith Stadium, as it was, to throw out a first pitch, he didn't need a Secretary of State to tell him who was who. He actually knew the players. You guys have been great. Thank you all for coming. This has been...
So Nixon spent an entire weekend at Camp David with David Eisenhower going through batting averages and ERAs to assemble those lists.
Right.
It was the Saturday and Sunday after he recorded the smoking gun tape in Watergate. That's what he was doing that weekend instead of thinking about Watergate.
Thanks.